Welcome everybody who is joining us now on YouTube. Again, welcome to everyone on YouTube. Welcome to our Wednesday study session that after 9.5 years remains nameless. I think we're going to wait to our 20th year and then we'll think of a name for it. So welcome to everyone who's joining us. We got a couple new people as well. And I know a lot of people are on YouTube who are not with us in Zoom. Welcome to everybody on Zoom, especially to our new guests, to Donna and Joel. And I hope everyone's doing well. And of course, Jeff, when you see it, not Jeff, Larry and Jane have the best background with the kid and the puzzle flying in the air. I'll show everybody them right now. So everybody can say hi for now, but that is an awesome one, Larry and Jane. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about Poland. Which of course is a subject matter that I imagine many of us have some information and some knowledge. It's of course very pertinent to all of us because a very high percentage of Jews in our country, a very high percentage who have ancestry who were Jewish, have a connection to Poland or the Pale Settlement. And I imagine if we asked everybody here, probably all of us would have grandparents or great-grandparents or parents or aunts and uncles who came from there or who died obviously in the Holocaust. And so probably more Jews have connection to that province, that area, than any other in history. As we know, at one point, it was the largest Jewish settlement. And at one point, I think we'll go over the numbers, but over 50% of all Jews lived in that area. So we're talking about a huge amount compared to obviously today. We'll see if we get that far.
No, it was it was once as much as 70%.
Yeah, it was.
Whatever, yeah. 1600s or something, yeah.
And what we'll learn, generally speaking, when we think of Poland, or this area, obviously Poland is controlled by different entities at different times. Obviously, it's different sizes. We think of it as a terrible place. We think of it, we have some fondness for the shtetl and the life of, Tevye, but we remember it more for the harsh moments. We remember for the, the assassination of the Tsar in 1881 and the pogroms that came afterwards. And that's generally what we think about when we think of Poland, but we're going to talk a little bit about how the Jews got there. We still, again, don't know how the numbers got to be so large, but how the Jews got there, more importantly, why Jews went there. And most importantly, to talk about not only the fact that it was a troubling period in our history, but to talk about the fact for a very large percentage of our time in that area, life was really good. For a good percentage of our time in Poland, it was one of the better places to be Jewish in the world. And we've kind of forgotten that, especially after the 18th century and all being put into the Pale Settlement when Poland or that area became under the control of Russia. But the reason we went there originally was the same reason we went anywhere, because of opportunities. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. We all, of course, will have our stories. So please, we want everybody to talk a little bit about it because, again, we all have our connection to Poland. We have stories passed down from the generations. Some of us don't have any. I'm one of those. Even though my family comes from there, I have no stories about Poland at all in my family. They didn't talk about it, apparently. But hopefully everybody else has some. Some of us may even know relatives who were raised. My grandmother came from Poland, but she died 2 years before I was born. So we have absolutely no knowledge of anybody because everybody was killed in the Holocaust except for one uncle who I never met who disappeared after he came to America. So as Karen mentioned, at one point over 70% of all Jews, maybe as high as 75%, lived in this area in the mid-16th century. So that, of course, is an incredible number. How they got there, again, as I've mentioned before, we know how people got there. We just don't know how that number became so incredibly high. We know where they were coming from at different periods, but the people we know who went there do not match the numbers. So the sheer numbers are beyond our understanding. Of course, the birth rate was very high, but we have to remember a lot of the periods when they were living there, they were living in prosperity. And as we know, when you live in prosperity, you tend to have a lot less children. That's just how it works. Everything is so expensive. And so yet the numbers just kept increasing. We can understand after things went bad, but the numbers just increased. We'll talk a little bit about where they came from. Obviously, we won't talk about the numbers, but we can talk a little bit about the theories behind that. But I think most important, we'll talk about first. One, it was, of course, the largest Ashkenazic settlement of Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years. Religious tolerance was something that was shared for a good percentage of the time, especially before the 18th century. We are going to talk a little about how things kind of went awry. We'll talk about the different possibilities, the different ways the Jewish community tended to flicker in and out. And we'll talk a little bit about, if we have time, the end of it. But as we'll see, again, it was not all bad. In fact, the majority of it was probably good in terms of comparison to the rest of the world. So when did we first go to Poland? Nobody knows 100% exactly when, but certainly by about 1,000 years ago, we were there. There were obviously the same reasons we went anywhere. And why did we go to Poland? The same reasons we went to America, the same reasons we went to Israel, the same reasons we went to Spain. We went because of opportunities. And one of the things we have to remember is Jews had skills. And when you have skills, people want those skills, especially up until the point where they've learned the skills. And so Jews had a wide range of skills from, of course, money lending, but also finance, but a lot of other areas. Plus, they were traders. Plus, Jews spoke similar languages, so they could trade in other countries with people who spoke the same language, which was, of course, became Yiddish, but there were other languages. But the first ones we know of were traders called Ratanites. And we're talking somewhere around 1,000 or a little bit before. So we don't have a lot of knowledge about this, but the first time it is mentioned, this area is sometime around 965. And when a Jewish trader mentions the Polish state, and of course, the Jewish trader was from probably the Ottoman Empire or possibly Spain, but this is the first time. So when we actually hear about the Jewish community and can kind of prove it, will be about the 11th century. That Jews are already living in Poland sometime there. And a lot of the Jews in Poland were people who were banished from other places or who came there from other places looking for brighter pastures. And so by the late 11th century, you already had Jews, those who had been kicked out of places like Prague, and other Jews were moving there because they had the skills. Again, they were fur traders, they were metal workers, they knew how to do linens, they knew how to trade. So all of a sudden you have Jews moving there. And then, of course, what happens during the 11th century that is so famous? And that, of course, is the Crusades. So we've got the Crusades that are going to begin at the end of the 11th century, which is going to sweep across large, the Crusades were meant to go take Jerusalem, but we know, although they do that eventually, most of the Crusaders didn't get anywhere near the Middle East. They just went marauding throughout the European countryside. And so this was a time where Jews were looking for a place to escape to, and they were promised and were given protection in Poland. And so we do know Jews started to move to Poland from a lot of the European areas because of the tolerance they found there. Lithuania as well, that whole area, not just Poland. We also know that they were all committed. So The most famous of the tolerant rulers was Casimir the Just, or Casimir. You may have heard of him. He's probably the most famous one, when certainly. And he is one of the ones who basically said Jews can come over here. They can be landowners. They can basically do most things. They could pick where they were going to live, which was a big deal. They could be part of the middle class of even higher of Polish society, which was really important because a lot of Jews were looking for that type of opportunity. I'm going to make sure if there's any thoughts or questions as we go on, because I know there's a lot of knowledge in this area. We'll go to Karen.
Well, I just have this book sitting here because I was using it last night.
What's the book called?
It's called A Travel Guide to Jewish Europe. It just happened to be sitting here. But Casimir, in 1334, he ascended to the throne, and he issued I'm just reading. He issued a proclamation that substantially broadened those privileges originally granted to Jews. And here's something I didn't know. It is recorded in legend that Casimir had a Jewish mistress, Esther, and that their daughters were raised as Jews. I had not heard that before.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons he became so famous in the Jewish world, because of this concubine, of girlfriend, whatever of his. But yeah, and of course, he was the most famous, but there were lots of enlightened rulers before and after.
Oh yeah,
he is by far the most famous because most of us, many of us have just heard of that name. But there was a lot of them who came from more. I looked up the names of the list, Boleslaw, and there were the general charters of Jewish liberties. This is all before him. Henry of Glockow. There were statutes. You have to also remember, Poland at this time was trying to, it's on the border of Russia. It's trying to keep out the Catholic Church as much as possible. And that is where a lot of the restrictions on Jews are. They don't mind Catholics, but they're trying to keep the Catholic Church out so that they can be a little bit freer in what they do. And by doing that, it kept out a lot of the anti-Jewish sentiment. For instance, blood libel, which of course was the most famous anti-Jewish story that began in the middle of the 11th century. That at different times was forbidden in Poland. You were not allowed to use or even retell the blood libel story, which is a really important thing because that was one of the most anti-Semitic stories. And one of the ways to keep Jews in their place was this idea of the blood libel, that Jews are killing children and using it in the matzah, as we know. So there are also several councils that at times made Jews wear stars, as again, depending on whether they were more strict or less strict. So there were times when this happened, you were supposed to wear the stars, but there were also times where Jews had complete autonomy, and that, again, you could not be charged with blood libel. It was against the law to be charged with blood libel. And the Polish diplomats and leaders probably basically said these stories are stupid and they're ridiculous and they're going to be illegal. So we don't realize that not only were they not allowed to, were they not listened to, they were illegal, which I didn't even realize that. And that is really, I think, to me, incredible. The whole idea that the blood libel story is illegal. I think that shows, so a lot of times we don't realize that for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you talked about Casimir, he's not until the mid 14th century. So Jews have been doing pretty well before him. I mean, he's the most famous, but it's really incredible to see that Jews had been able to work in almost all fields. At times, they were even allowed to hold offices. You could not kidnap Jewish children and forcibly baptize them, which was a very famous tradition. In fact, if you did that in some cases, it was punishable by death. So these treatments of Jews that became pretty much the accepted view of the time were really banned in Poland. You could not desecrate a Jewish cemetery. That's another one that, of course, we all seen what happened. So as Jews are being kicked out of Western Europe, England and Spain, and England is 1290, France in, I just forgot the date, the 14th century, Germany, and eventually Spain in 1492. Some of them are going to this area. And that's really incredible because we keep, again, mentioning, we think of Poland in the negative. Now, another thing that brought Jews to Poland was, of course, the Black Death in the mid-14th century at pretty much the same time as Casimir. So it was very fortuitous that he was so enlightened, because you have these Jews who were fleeing from all over Europe, Central and Western Europe, because they were being blamed for the Black Death. And it's almost exactly at the same time as where Casimir writes these new laws giving freedoms. Any thoughts on this before we continue? All right.
Yeah, I had one, Rabbi, right. And it's a distinction that I think is important.
Great.
My family lived in Poland for roughly 500 years.
Do you have a timeline going back with the family names?
Yeah, as a matter of fact.
That's amazing. You don't see that very often.
Yeah, 1540 to 1942.
Wow. That is incredible. You almost never see a Jewish person who has that kind of, that's amazing.
It was oral tradition. Within my dad's family, it was oral tradition.
That's awesome.
And he only shared a smidgen of that. But something that is important to mention, you're absolutely right. Poland welcomed Jews during all of those centuries. And during some of that time, the Polish kings allowed Jewish self-government. There was the Council of the Four Lands during the Renaissance period and so forth. But the conclusion I've come to on that is, here's a major difference between people coming to a place like the United States and people going to a place like Poland. People coming to the United States, the expectation was that everyone that came here would jump into the melting pot gladly and become Americans. In the Polish example, there was no move, if you will, to assimilate Jews so that they would become Jewish Poles. Just the opposite. Jews were a standalone community with civil rights. They had their place in that society. They were Polish Jews. It was never intended for them to become Jewish Poles. And I think it's an important distinction.
And it is, and I think it's part of the world that they lived in. In that world, there was no individual. You were not an individual. You were part of a group.
Yeah.
You were a peasant. Most people lived within the bounds of a certain societal, constant. You're the upper echelon, you're the artist, you're the military, you're you're working a shipbuilder, or you work in ships, you're a farmer, you're an elite, and you're Jewish. So everybody had their place in society. And you're right, that was just the world they lived in until really the 18th and more the 19th century. This idea of being an individual was not in existence. You were part of something. And very rarely could you leave that and move to a different thing. It happened, obviously. But they were not Jewish Poles. They were Jews living in Poland, as opposed to Jewish Americans today. And I think that's a really good point. And so what we see, though, is through, of course, obviously the Black Death did have an impact, but through the mid-14th century, Jews are doing pretty well. And they are succeeding. They definitely have a lot of protection. There are issues that come later because of the Black Death. And because Catholicism does make its way into Poland, so you do see not necessarily kings or the leaders, but religious leaders starting to bring the blood libel in at times, starting to blame Jews for the Black Death. So it's really not like the kings, it is the people they were trying to keep out for so long for just this reason. And so, but again, it's nothing compared to what's going on in Western Europe, which is already starting the ghetto movement. And in fact, at times in the 14th and 15th centuries, Jews were given more rights than other people, certainly more than peasants. I found easy. They were able to own salt mines, work with the mints. They were able to own towns. Obviously, they were doing the money lending. They were very much representatives of the leaders as tax collectors. We know that was something a lot of the Lithuanians were paying their taxes to Jews who were giving it back to the Poles. And that, of course, was protection, because if there was some sort of rebellion, it would go against the Jews. But really, until the 15th century, things were going pretty good. And you can go through the list of the really supportive kings and the areas where they lived. But the decline starts in the 15th century. Another Casimir came in and he kind of stemmed that for a while. But a lot of the privileges that they had start to leave at the end of the 15th century. And obviously, there's a couple reasons. One of them is, of course, the Reformation. And again, before it was just different Catholics or Russian Orthodox, but now you all of a sudden have Protestants. So there's a major competition, whereas before it was a monopoly in Western and Central Europe, that changes. And that really hampers the Jews in many ways, because both sides fear that the Jews will go with them. Protestants fear the Jews will be connected to Catholics. Catholics fear they'll be connected to the Protestants. So this, although it doesn't have as much effect as it does in Western Europe and Central Europe, does have an effect. But funny enough, as all this is happening and as the rights start to decline, things change again especially after the Jews are kicked out of Spain. And all of a sudden, again, Poland becomes a place where everybody is moving to, and the prosperity continues when it looked like it would disappear. So in the 16th century, things started to look up despite the Reformation, despite the exile from Spain, despite the Black Death. And Jewish life really continues to grow. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, you'll see Jewish life at almost its peak in these areas. How do we know this? Because we see what happens when Jews are living in tolerant lands. And again, remember, at this point, 75% in the 16th century of Jews live in Poland. Poland is the center of the Jewish universe. Although mostly Ashkenazi, you do have some Sephardic Jews living there. You have some Mizrahi Jews. You also have some Persian Jews. And so you have the first chief rabbi of Poland is in the 16th century at the beginning. The Jews were allowed again to work for the crown. They were allowed to raise money for themselves. You have one of the greatest Talmudic scholars of all time in Krakow in the 16th century. So basically, what we remember as a bad time isn't still not happening yet. It looked like it was going to get bad. It looked like things were going to turn in the mid 15th and late 15th century, but then by the 16th century, everything turns the other way. And you have people like Moses of Cicerles, who is the great Talmudic scholar who works with Joseph Caro to complete one of the greatest of all Jewish works, the Shulchan Aruch. If you go to Krakow now, you will still see his synagogue there and where he's buried. I bet many of us probably have been there. And there's other prominent one, but he is the most prominent Talmudist, but he was also an expert in other areas, including Kabbalah. But we think of Jews in this area of Poland as only being Jewish scholars. They know Talmud, maybe Kabbalah, nothing else. That is not for 200 more years. That's not till the 18th and 19th century. In the 16th century, they are still studying medicine and astronomy and math. So they have not only Jewish knowledge, but they also have knowledge from the outside world, not to the level of probably the Jews of the Ottoman world or as it was in Spain, but it's pretty much a very knowledgeable group of people, still centered on the Talmud, but also knowledgeable in other things. So by the 16th century, late 16th century, all of Jews basically living in this area were living in tolerant lands. In fact, in the late 16th century, it was agreed upon by most, if not all, of the Polish nobles that Jews would have pretty much the almost complete rights, living almost autonomously. And this is what we call about the Council of the Four Lands that Joel has mentioned. So it's really quite incredible, the prosperity. Now, before we get to the start of the decline, does anybody else have anything they want to mention? Thoughts? Stuart and then Larry. Sorry for keeping you so long. And you're still on mute, Stuart, just to let you know.
A comment and a question.
Stuart, could you turn up your mic a little bit? I don't think we can hear you. Is it just me?
No, it's probably.
Just maybe get closer and speak up a little bit.
I can turn up. There we go. The mic's up a little bit. Okay. A comment and a question. The comment is. Can't hear you. What's going on with my mic?
Well, yeah, we're having trouble hearing you. So why don't you fix that? We'll come back to you after Larry. We'll go to Larry first. We'll come back to you, Stuart, see if Larry's mic's working.
I think you can get me now.
A little bit. But maybe if you just say, maybe move up your chair and get a little closer.
Okay.
That's a little bit better.
Good. A comment and a question. One of the things about Jewish learning that went on, and this goes back to the 1000 and 1100. Why are you shaking your head? You disagreeing with me, Karen?
She's just so used to doing it right away. It's just it's an automatic.
I didn't even say anything yet.
I know, that's why she's just.
Okay. All right. So the first thing is that in the 11th and 12th century, or just before that, that's when the major
closer to you if you want.
academies in Babylonia closed.
You can get us both in.
I think let me go back to you real quick. Okay, Larry, would you mention that one more time?
Let me go into the other room.
Okay.
Could you repeat that, Rabbi? I can't hear him.
He's going to go, I think, into with Karen right now and maybe speak there, see if that works better. I think he was talking about the closing of the academies and you're on mute there, Stuart.
During the 10th, 11th century,
Perfect.
the major yeshivot and the who's talking?
You know that you need to put your other one on mute.
What?
There you
I heard. Oh, okay. Yeah, that
go.
was me.
Put your other one. If in the same room, you got to put it on mute. Okay.
Okay. What had happened was that the major yeshivot in Babylon, where the Talmud Bavli, the one we used, was developed, closed in the late 900s, early 1000s. And that's one of the things that drove Poland to become the Talmudic and Jewish educational center that was there. The area around Jerusalem had already been, or was being cut off because of the Crusades, so that wasn't available. Babylon, for whatever reason, had gone into decline, so it became necessary to have a new center. That became Poland. That also had to do with the Jews coming from Germany and France. They had come from places like Trier to Metz and a few other places. And then when they stopped, because of the proximity to the Crusades, ended up moving further east. So they ended up in Poland. Question.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, again, a lot of Jews moved to Spain, where it was very tolerant, as we know. And then some moved to Poland. And then after Jews were kicked out of Spain, more again moved to Poland. You move to wherever is the best place for you.
Poland was an easy move then because they were moving away from the Crusades. Spain was bringing them down the Crusade path.
Right. And again, you just kind of, everybody's still connected a bit if you're Jewish, even if you're not speaking the same language necessarily, but that's what happened. Yeah.
I have a question also. The Roman Church was very intolerant of money lending. That's how the Jews became money lenders. In Poland, which at that point, I guess was roughly considered part of the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman empires, or closely allied to it, did that church have the same attitude toward money lending, or as strong an attitude toward money lending as did the Roman Church?
Well, remember, Poland is kind of in the middle. They're not really part of the Holy Roman Empire. They're not really part of the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox. So it really depends who's in control. And for a long time, they tried to limit the control of the Catholic Church in their country. Eventually, obviously, it's going to become under Russian control.
Yeah.
So they were Catholic, but it was not to the level that you'd see in other places where it was completely under the control of the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah.
Okay, closer to the Eastern Rite then.
Yeah,
So,
and again, Poland is kind of this netherworld in Lithuania that at this point, it's still an entity unto itself, but eventually it's going to be divided up in different places, Russia, Austria, Lithuania, so under different controls. But yeah, there was Catholicism there. And at times the priest would start to create friction, but the leadership was not under the control of the Roman of the church as much. So that's why they tried to keep it at arm's length, and for good reason. That obviously, if you can keep control under your auspices, you prefer that than somebody else.
thank you.
And Larry, but again, eventually it's going to become part of the Roman. But then again, you see what happens in the modern world. One of the most prominent popes of all time ends up coming from Poland. Larry.
Rabbi, I was interested in your comment before about the Jews who were sort of like into the secular world at the time. They were, you said, medicine and sciences and astronomy.
A little bit, not to the extent that was in Spain, but certainly much more than later on.
What do you think caused them to go more insular then into this world of the Chabad, and what made the movement then, or this? Because you think of Poland as being pretty much, as a,
right,
shtetl type society. Why did they move that?
And we're going to go perfect timing, by the way. Did you have any other questions before we go to that? Karen, but that's what we're going to go right into now, Larry, right after we finish with Karen, whoever else. But that's a great question.
Well, two things. I wanted to mention I think Poland, up until the Jews started going there, was somewhat backward.
Yeah, it definitely was not.
The Jews that brought them out of the Dark Ages, if you will. But then also we keep saying Poland, but then by, I think it was 1385, I just looked it up. They merged with Lithuania.
They merged for a while.
And it became even more powerful and that much larger. So, and the other thing I want to mention, if this is where you're going or when you get to it, I pulled up a map of the partition of Poland. So
from which one? From World War II?
No, from the 1700s.
Oh, earlier, okay.
Yeah, what led to the Pale.
Yeah,
So when you get to that point, if you make me co-host, I can share that map.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, I forgot
Yeah,
to
I
get
have
the link,
that
but-
from my class.
and we're going to talk about the Pale Settlement. A lot of people think the Pale Settlement started 1,000 years ago. The Pale Settlement started with Catherine the Great, who
Yes.
actually wasn't as anti-Jewish as many people. In fact, funny enough, our congregation was founded in 1733. One of the men who founded our congregation, Samuel Nunez, who was the leader, who was caught being a converso. He was the doctor to the Grand Inquisitor in Portugal and treated the king as well. Wasn't killed when he was caught, but he eventually escaped. His nephew was Jewish and was the doctor to Catherine the Great. And that was just recently found out. Yes, we wrote a book about it. And they actually came to do some research at our synagogue and shared that with us. And sure enough. So what changes, or what, I mean, again, it's going to stay around this way, but the major event that really begins some sort of a change is, of course, the very famous and very unfortunate, and again, I never pronounce his name, Helmitsky Uprising. I almost did my rabbinical thesis on it. I decided I did a lot of research and it was getting really depressing. And so I said, I don't really want to spend a year working on this. And so I switched, but it's if you haven't heard of it, this is one of the defining moments in Jewish history, the most famous moment. And this is, of course, the Great Uprising in 1648. Now, this is shortly after one of the Black Death. And this was one of the great, probably second to Spain in the last couple of hundred years, the massacre of Jews was probably nothing like it since Spain and nothing after it until the Holocaust. So if you talk about one of the reasons it's not as famous today is because the Holocaust was obviously so much worse than anything we'd ever encountered. But this was one of the telling moments, if not the telling moments, of what Larry just mentioned. So we just had, of course, the Black Death, which had really not affected the Jews in Poland as much as in other places. And then this man, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who was a very wealthy landowner, led a rebellion in which almost 200,000 people died, Jewish people died during this. And what he basically, he was a pre-Cossack, however you want to call it. They were upset about the Ukrainians were upset about the Polish nobles controlling Ukraine. And of course, a lot of the Polish nobles used Jews to collect all of the taxes, all of the stuff. And so when the uprising occurred, they went after the Jews, and it kind of just spread like wildfire. And the kings and the leaders were unable to protect the Jews during this time. You also had Russian invaders coming in. You had there's like all of these things happening at the same time. And Sweden will eventually take over parts of Poland during this. So this terrible time for Jews, there's a belief that maybe 20% of everyone killed was Jewish. I mean, 20%, is it 20% of the Jewish population, maybe? I don't remember. I don't think it was Jewish 20%. Anyway, an incredible number of Jews. I got to look that up again. I forgot the number. So it was the largest number of Jews killed at any one moment until the Holocaust. 200,000 Jews are killed. Fortunes are taken. Houses are burned. People are sent everywhere. It is a terrible time. Maybe a third of the Jewish population was lost to Poland as people ran to other places. And so this really could have been the end of this period. Interestingly enough, afterwards, the Jewish community bounces back and has another renewal of spirit that's going to last until the mid-18th century. But what this directly leads to is what Larry was asking it leads into Hasidism. It leads to Sabbateism. If you don't know about the great Shabtai Zvi, who was the guy who claimed to be the Messiah, and he had a huge following. This happened right after and as a result of Helmitsky. So it's basically the world is ending for the Jewish community, and this guy Shabtai Zvi claims to be the Messiah. And so he gets a huge following. Eventually, he converts to Islam rather than being killed. But his name continues to be, he is the most recognized messianic figure from for about a 2,000-year period, probably until the Chabad rabbi, the Lubavitch rabbi in recent times. And so because of this, you see the Hasidim led or started by, of course, the Baal Shem Tov. And this, of course, is what leads to many of these things. So the Baal Shem Tov is born at the end of the 17th century. And he, of course, brings Kabbalah. He brings this fervent view of how he combines the Luria mysticism that had also come up in this area, but hundreds of years earlier, into what we see today, this kind of fervent belief and praying. It's all mixed in with Shabtai Zvi as well. And so this is one of the things that leads to more introverted Jewish study. And I'm sorry, Luria is only the century before. Luria is, the century before, 1 century before. So you have a combination of the Talmudic scholars like Isserles, the Kabbalah scholars like Isaac Luria, and then later the Hasidim, founded by the Baal Shem Tov, all in generally the same area at different periods of time. Yes, Joel.
Let's interrupt, Rabbi. Kind of a comment and a kind of question wrapped
Perfect.
in this as well. So, I mean, you're right. Everything I've ever read, everything I've ever heard after the Helmitsky revolt and all of that disruption, Jews were really dispirited between Shabtai Tzvi and so on and so forth. But wasn't there another factor out of Lithuania, the Gaon of Vilna, and this rabbinical? I think the phrase they used was they built a wall around the Torah, so that regular people were kind of left out there, and study and prayer and so forth was reserved for this religious elite, if you will. And I could be portraying that incorrectly. Centered around a man in Lithuania called the Gaon of Vilna. And during that time too, people like the Baal Shem Tov led this kind of spiritual revival, spiritual renewal among regular Jews in Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, etc. Am I on the right track there?
You're exactly on the right track. You're a little bit ahead of time, because the Gaon of Vilna happens about 80 years later, but he is going to be like the central figure for what. So what you mean, the wall is exactly right. After the Helmitsky Uprising, after Shabtai Zvi, after the Black Death, although it didn't affect Poland as much, a lot of the Jews turned inward. And this is, but not all of them yet, because there's still a lot of freedom. They're going to have another renaissance before they completely are cut off from society. So a lot of them do go insular and start looking at the Talmud. And this is where they start discussing every detail of the Talmud to ridiculous levels, beyond anything that would matter to the normal person. And this is the wall they build around themselves. So some are already starting to build this wall after these things happen, but not everybody yet, because there's still going to be a lot of good things happening in Poland after the Helmitsky Uprising calms down. Then during the rise of Hasidism, during the rise of Shabtai Zvi, you're going to have another period of time where there's a lot of freedom given to Jews. And up until the mid 18th century, Jews are starting, the Jews dress like the Poles now after the Helmitsky. There were Jews who were mingling with the upper elite in the early 18th century. You're going out to drink, you're going to party, Jews partying with the upper elite, not just doing business, but actually partying with them and hanging out with them. And so this is really what happens after the Helmitsky rebellion dies down. But then what you're going to have is more wars. You're going to have the Swedes. You don't think of Sweden as being powerful, but they're going to take over for part of the time. And then eventually what happens, and we're running out of time, is, of course, Russia takes over. So what, and the Gun of Vilna will happen during this period. So in the mid 18th century, Poland is taken over, most of it, by Russia. And once Russia takes over, at least they don't take over all of it, but they take over the area in which a lot of Jews live. And so mid 18th century, really even earlier, and again, Catherine the Great is the most famous one because she starts the Pale Settlement. So Russia, of course, had a very different view of Jews than did the Polish nobles. And so in the mid 18th century, the Jews are then gathered up, and by the time of the French Revolution or by the American Revolution, the Jews have been put pretty much into this area we now call the Pale Settlement. So at the end of the 18th century, almost all these Jews are living there. And this is where you think of, a lot of them are put in walled cities. And if you're in a city, you're behind a wall, but if a lot of them are sent into little small communities, and this is where the shtetl comes about. So we weren't in shtetls until the very late 18th century. And this is where you have the Gaon of Vilna and all of once we are now in this area, outside learning is almost off limits. And so in a very short time, comparatively 60, 70 years, Jews are rounded up, put into these areas. Not all Jews, but the highest percentage are living there. You still had Jews living in Russia, living in in the middle class, a very small percentage. You had a small percentage of Jews living in Western and Central Europe. Most of them are living in ghettos, but some of them, especially in places like Holland, are living in society as well. Most of them are those Sephardic. So that's when the Pale settlements go. And this is really where people like the Gaon of Vilna start to take over. This is where Hasidim is prominent. This is where Talmudic learning is the only learning. And you had to stretch out or scratch out a living as best as you could, because the Tsarist policies against the Jews were very, very different than the Polish leaders had been. And so, you couldn't teach Yiddish. You couldn't own land. This is where this all comes in. And it really hits its worst moment in the 1820s with another czar, not Nicholas II, but Nicholas I. And how bad is he? What does anybody know what his nickname was? He was so bad that his nickname was Haman II. That's how bad it was. And so he restricted him even more. As I said, Catherine the Great had put him there, and she had put up restrictions, but they got worse after her because she was as anti-Jewish as others. So Karen, do you have that map you'd like to show us, by the way?
You have to make me co-host, and then I can.
All right. I'm trusting you, by the way. And quite frankly, I don't trust. Okay. I'll stay host. All right.
Oh, you will, and just make me co-host.
Okay.
And I can share my screen.
All right, I trust you. Here we go.
While this is going on, I'd like to just point out that the Mitnagdim, which are the people that Joel was really talking about, before the Vilna Gaon, established a couple of things, but the key is that they were really anti-Hasidism, not anti-communication with the Poles. And the idea there was in the leadership, the Hasidim wanted to bring in this idea of all people being able to communicate with Hashem directly and have these joyous services. The Mitnagdim wanted to keep it among the rabbis and all of the decisions made there. An outgrowth of that was the Vilna Gaon.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make. I'm sorry, keep going.
Also, just of interest, currently the Lubavitcher and maybe other Hasidim, but I know the Lubavitcher refer to the Mitnagdim not as Mitnagdim, but as Litvak, because it was centered in Lithuania.
And again, I think you make a good point, an excellent point not everybody realizes, and this is going to start happening a little bit more, that Hasidim at the beginning wasn't something that was popular with everybody. It was considered the enemy by what you'd call the other, they weren't Orthodox yet, but the other traditional Jews thought these were crazy people. And so they were in competition for the same group of people. So the Mitnagdim and the Hasidim still at times do not get along. Like you think of Hasidim and ultra-Orthodox, not Hasidim, ultra-Orthodox is a general name for all of them. But the Hasidim do not get along still with some of the other sects. Say as kind of Chabad does not get along with other sects as well. So it's not like they're all one, but here you see,
Oops.
they,
Wait a minute. I don't know what happened. Hang on a second.
Time's on the course. I think you go back the other way.
All right, I got it.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
There it is.
So thank you. If you would send me this too, I'd love to have this.
Sure.
So here you see, now during this period, Poland is going to be partitioned 3 times. And these are considered the 3 major partitions of Poland. And here they are.
So just so you can, I don't know if you can, if everyone can read the, what's it called? Well, the little inset with the colors, but the sort of the circle part is what was Prussia, which eventually became Germany. The 2 green areas here, if you see where I'm pointing, that's what became Austria, the Kingdom of Austria-Hungary. I guess it was just the Habsburg Empire. And then all this is what went over to Russia. And most of this is really what became the PAM, the part that went over to Russia. So that just, okay.
Perfect. And again, I think it's great. And we're not gonna finish everything today. I'm sorry. We made, if you don't mind, next week we'll finish this up next week, because we still have not gotten to the very important 19th century and 20th century, which is, of course, is a really essential part. But I think the most important thing to remember is that Jews, we were not in the Pale Settlement this whole time. Jews were not living in restricted worlds like everybody else as much as we thought. And that Jews were, for a very long time, living in Poland with rights that other Jews did not have. Maybe obviously Spain was even better. The Ottoman Empire times was better, but the Polish were very good to the Jews. Even in World War II, we know there were a lot of Poles who worked with the Nazis, but there were a lot of Poles who did not, and a lot of Poles who even risked their lives to save Jews. I mean, we know a lot of them, and we know the issues now in Poland, which we did not get to it at all. So before we conclude, and if you don't mind taking this down, and then we'll just... And
There's one question on the...
before you do, Karen, Larry wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'm just interested. I see the word Poland in 2 places, one in large print over toward the right end of the circle, like 3 o'clock on the circle. And then with the pointer just was, there's a little word Poland just above the word South Prussia.
Right.
Why do you think it's in 2 places there?
I think that's a good question.
It's also, the big one there is a whole bigger area. Like the big one is kind of the before partition, I would guess, or again, it got smaller and smaller. So the smaller one is probably the third partition, where the first one is probably what it was. But the whole area you're seeing now, I think a lot of that may have been part of Poland, but I have to check it out.
Yeah, there's Little Poland also on the bottom of the screen there at like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock.
Yeah, I think that's what they got. That's what they ended up becoming after all the partitions.
Yeah. Because I'm sorry, go ahead, Stuart.
I was just going to say, the whole map is what was Poland before in 1770. And what you're seeing on here are the places that it had developed into by 1795, 96. So the map is sort of funny. If you think of this map as being a 1770 map, the whole broad thing is Poland.
Yeah, you have to read the first part. You have to read the color coding. It looks like
exactly on the bottom.
I see it. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, for instance, my grandparents on my mother's side came from Minsk and Vitebsk, where I'm pointing. I didn't know until I found this map that had been part of Poland up until in the 1700s. So I always thought of them as right. And today it's Belarus. So it's and Poland ceased to. I just want to share this. Poland did not exist. The culture existed and people thought of themselves as Polish, but as a nation state, it did not exist from 1795 till after World War I. And I'll give you an example. My great grandfather emigrated to America. And as a kid, I always said, why don't they know what country they're from? My great grandfather, my father's grandfather, emigrated to the United States around 1901 or 2. His immigration on Ellis Island, his record, the manifest says he's from Russia. Then he goes back to Poland or Russia, and he comes back again to the United States after World War I. So in 1921, when he re-enters, this time the manifest says he's from Poland. So when I found that, I said, oh my gosh, they really, I finally understood why they didn't know what country they were from. Sometimes they said Russia, sometimes Poland. So that explains it. Okay, are you ready for me to take this down?
Yeah, again, that's great. And I think also we have to realize that we're looking at it from a knowledgeable view and looking at the past. If you were in the moment, live in these areas, you may not even known what country you were in because it didn't affect you. Unless the armies swept across your area, you didn't even know if you were in Poland or Russia or Ukraine or Lithuania. You just knew that you were in the shtetl in this area. And so when my grandmother came to America, I think she had Russia on it, although she may have been from Warsaw, but she could have also just put Russia because Russia was considered a higher class of people than Poland. So when she got here, she may wanted to sound Russian. So, but yeah.
Okay,
all right.
Take this down.
Yeah, please, if you don't mind, Karen.
Okay, got it.
All right. So next week we'll move everything back. I'll try and I'm gonna put everybody in gallery again. So next week we'll go into the 19th and 20th century and 21st century Poland, because we all know I hate to talk about Poland and not talk about what's happening today. As we all know, some of the issues that have become, I mean, if you look at Poland in the news right now, it has a lot to do with the new laws concerning the Holocaust and their issues they're having with Israel, when 10 years ago, they had really good relations with Israel. So you know how things can change. And we'll talk a little bit about the immigration to America and a little bit what happened in Poland after everybody left, after the Holocaust. And as you may or may not know, the Polish Jewish community has actually increased quite a bit over the last 20 years. I think it's quadrupled in size. That may change now, but so most people don't realize, I think it went down to a low of maybe 40 or 50,000, maybe even less. And now I think it's up to like 200,000, something like that. So I think it may have gone down to even 5,000 or something after World War II. I'll look up those numbers again. Any thoughts or questions? It's always a pleasure. You guys are so knowledgeable. It makes it so. And Joel and Donna, please join us anytime. We can only go through so much, considering we just went over about 800 years of history in less than in about an hour. But next week, and I'll double check to make sure that that our wonderful hosts next week understand I think everybody feels more comfortable doing it online right now than in person in a house. Yeah. Okay. All right. So happy, it's not New Year, but happy January. And hope everybody's staying safe. And if there's anything you need, let me know.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Stay safe,
Thank you all for
everybody.
sharing your knowledge.
Hey, no, you guys are the ones.
Well,
Thanks, guys.
what I showed you was from my class on the history of Jewish immigration.
Yeah, and if you would send me that, would you send me that PowerPoint if you don't mind? I'd love to. If you,
Yeah, it's a long, I don't know if I get, I'll email you that slide anyway.
okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. Okay.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thanks.